A big fat hoax. That's how Donald Trump categorizes a new bombshell report about an FBI investigation into whether the president is working for Moscow. How did we get here and what happens next? We'll take a look at that on this edition of Politics. Welcome to Politicking. I'm Larry King. Over the weekend, a brand new bombshell report dropped which detailed an FBI investigation into whether U.S. President Donald Trump was working to advance Moscow's agenda. The president calls it insulting and a hoax. This is the government shutdown is now the longest in American history with no end in sight. Lots to discuss. We begin with our political panel. In Washington, D.C., David Brown, Democratic strategist. He served as majority counsel to Democratic Senator Patty Murray on 2 congressional committees. Also in Washington is Adolfo Franco, former member of the George W. Bush administration. He served as assistant administrator of USAID. He was also a spokesperson for the John McCain and Mitt Romney presidential campaigns. All right, David, what's your read on this report in the Times over Trump involved with Moscow, reporting Trump personally intervened to keep information on his one-on-one conversations with Putin under wraps?
Larry, it's a very serious report, obviously, and it raises the stakes even more. I didn't think the stakes could get higher, but I think it raises the stakes in terms of the Mueller investigation and what he will ultimately report to the American people and to the Congress. But, look, I mean, there are very serious concerns raised in the New York Times reporting, specifically the testimony by the FBI general counsel that was leaked to the Times. And in that testimony before the Congress, he recounts internal deliberations among special agents and as to whether or not they needed to open a counterintelligence investigation. I mean, remember, there are 2 types of investigations the FBI opens, criminal and then counterintelligence. And really the latter is focused on whether or not an individual is susceptible to influence by a foreign actor or working on behalf of a foreign actor. And in this instance, there clearly was alarm as to whether or not the president was compromised. But, this is in my mind, this raises the table stakes, and it reinforces the criticality of allowing Bob Mueller to complete his investigation. I also think in the interest of transparency, because of the questions that are implicated here, a sitting United States president, I think it's really important that the testimony, the transcripts of the FBI testimony before the House, that to the extent it can be released, declassified, it should be. I think the American people have a right to see that testimony in its entirety.
Adolfo, what's your read? Can this get more bizarre?
Well, I think it's bizarre that we now have what I think the president has said for some period of time, apparently a rogue government. I've never been a big believer in really a deep state or really FBI agents or others acting independently, but I'm beginning to change my mind because this is exactly what the president has feared all along, that there were individuals, not only after he became president, but during the presidential campaign at the FBI and at the Justice Department, and frankly within the Obama administration, that were doing everything possible to make sure he was not elected, and then if he were elected, to do everything possible to destroy the president by using the machinery of government. And I think this is what we've seen here. And when we talk about the individuals involved in making these decisions have been completely discredited. They've been, former acting director McCabe, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, individuals who have on the record said that they were doing everything possible to prevent, first of all, Donald Trump from becoming president, and then having a game plan to make sure that he would be destroyed if he were elected president. So I think this exactly confirms the president's concerns that there has been a concerted effort to use every means possible to discredit him and to destroy his presidency. And I think that should be a big concern. One of the things Dave said, which I agree with, is leaked. If this were so sensitive, we had such respect for the FBI and the agents involved, why was it, by who leaked this information, and why was it leaked to the New York Times, other than what is clearly here a political agenda to destroy President Trump?
David,
and I think that's the big story.
David, do you believe that Donald Trump has a special private relationship with Vladimir Putin?
Larry, I don't know the answer to that question, but I would like to understand why the president thought it was appropriate to seize notes, contemporaneous notes of his conversations with Vladimir Putin, and why those notes are not available to other officials within the United States government, and why he is protecting those conversations to such an extent. I mean, that is unprecedented. When you are a president, you're surrounded by a lot of people. You're inside a bubble, and every word you utter is captured. It's recorded, both for posterity's sake, for better or for worse, but also because it has the force and effect of U.S. foreign policy, the weight of policy behind it. And so the fact that the president is having these one-off sideline conversations or even conversations in plain sight, but then seizing notes in an effort to keep them confidential, I want to understand why that is. But look, Adolfo raised some pretty interesting, I think, revisionist history when it comes to the FBI's actions in the lead up to 2016. I mean, let's be really clear about what we know. We know that during the 2016 campaign, 4 people associated with Donald Trump's campaign were already under investigation by the FBI because of concerns, very credible concerns, that they were acting on behalf of a foreign power. We know it is not at all a question that Russia sought to interfere and intervene with obvious effect in our election. That's the consensus view of the intelligence community. And so, I agree that there are unfortunate questions around Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, much because the right has been very effective in raising those concerns. But that shouldn't negate or otherwise undermine the very serious concerns that the FBI was attempting to act on. And, Donald Trump really hasn't made this easy on himself. He was on Fox News this weekend, and he wouldn't even answer the question whether or not he was working on behalf of Russia. That should be a pretty simple yes or no question. And the president refused to answer.
Adolfo, doesn't it concern you, even of the possibility that we have a president who may be a threat to national security?
Well, it doesn't concern me because I think it's a completely fabricated story. And frankly, I share the president's conclusion. It's a hoax. On Monday, the president clearly on his way to New Orleans stated to the press corps, I have never worked for Russia. So I think he's put that to bed. If there was some ambiguity about when he said it was such an insulting question, meaning that absolutely, when he responded on Fox, that he shouldn't even be asked that question. But he answered the question very directly because it's such a ludicrous question to suggest that. The fact of the matter is, when we keep saying, Dave, when we keep saying FBI, somehow this is a building or some institution. They're individuals, and yes, I think it is important to talk about Peter Strzok and Lisa Page and their record on the record in writing a desire to frustrate President Trump's campaign and then later impede his presidency. So I think the record is quite clear in that regard. With respect to keeping notes, it isn't just President Putin. When the president met with the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, he did the same thing. Why? I think the president has come to realize by the events we're talking about on this program that he can't trust anyone. He certainly cannot trust FBI agents. He can't trust others that are leaking information.
That presumes he can't trust people within his own administration, within the White House. I mean, he's keeping the notes from his own aides at the White House. That's a pretty damning comment on his own administration, isn't it?
Well, let me answer that. Early on in his administration, when he trusted some of these individuals that have had long-standing relationships with others in government, since Donald Trump is not a politician, almost all the aides and so forth that have been brought in are from the government and not from his personal circle, obviously, because he doesn't have a government background. When he placed calls to the president of Mexico and the prime minister of Australia early on, when all this was quite open and everything was being documented, all these things were leaked to the press. They were embarrassing to the president of the United States. And I think as a consequence of that, as he has done in his dealings in the private sector, the president feels more comfortable, as he said, having a one-on-one conversation with President Putin or other foreign leaders and not have these notes and these other documents made with with his concern that these will be divulged.
Adolfo, I got to ask you, because you obviously are a former official in the George W. Bush administration. You were a spokesman for Senator McCain and Governor Romney. Can you imagine ever having these types of conversations in a President Romney or a President McCain administration? Or did you ever have to worry about these sorts of things in a President Bush administration? My hunch is the answer probably is no. And to me, that's actually the point here, that we are in such an extraordinary time with this president and some of the reckless actions and just frankly bizarre actions coming out of his administration, that we find ourselves now in this crazy scenario where we're talking about why the president seized notes about his own meetings with a head of a country that is clearly not our friend, that in fact is an adversary, our stated foe in 2016, trying to interfere with our elections. The president doesn't even want his own administration to have access to notes, of contemporaneous notes of meetings with Vladimir Putin. To me, that is extraordinary, and I have to guess that a President Romney, a President McCain, and a President Bush would never stand for that.
But the extraordinary circumstances that we face today are that the press, the Washington class, from the beginning, have viewed Donald Trump as illegitimate or an individual who should never have been president. So Donald Trump has come into the presidency with a series, I think, of initiatives that are designed to destroy him and his presidency. That is the difference between Donald Trump and Mitt Romney or John McCain or anyone else. I mean, you have the New York Times almost in 2016 saying that it's not in their editorial page, but in the news coverage, they have an obligation, in essence, to end Trump's candidacy and presidency because he was not fit to be president.
So if that I think they were focused on an obligation to fact check him and to ensure.
I think everyone has come to realize, I believe, there is an agenda now that we have seen, an aggressiveness, not by coverage of course the press is free to cover any news event, but news media, by and large, seeking to do everything possible to destroy this president. And that is what has led President Trump to take these extraordinary steps, I think, to ensure that what conversations he has had, initiatives he's about to embark, are kept under wraps. And I think that's absolutely his prerogative and absolutely perfect to do so.
David Brown and Adolfo Franco are my guests. We'll have more with them after this.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.
In a world of fake partisan news, lies, and conspiracy,
it's time to wake up, to dig deeper, to hit the stories that mainstream media refuses to tell. More than ever, we need to be smarter. We need to stop slamming the door on the facts and shouting past each other. It's time for critical thinking. It's time to fight for the middle, for the truth. The time is now for watching closer, for watching the Hawks.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.
Welcome back to Politicking. Returning to the political panel, David Brown, Democratic strategist, served as majority counsel to the Democratic Senator Patty Murray on 2 congressional committees. Adolfo Franco, former member of the George W. Bush administration, served as assistant administrator of USAID and was also a spokesperson for John McCain and Mitt Romney's presidential campaigns. David, the government shutdown, longest in American history. Who's responsible? What are the consequences?
Well, look, Larry, a poll that came out on January 13th, a CNN poll conducted by SSRS, I believe. I think it's pretty telling. a majority of Americans blame the president for the shutdown. 55% blame the president. 56% of Americans are opposed to building the wall. This is really a crisis of the president's creation, and it's absolutely unnecessary, and it's a shame. And I mean, look, I served as an aide in the Senate in 2013. I was one of the people furloughed during that shutdown. And these shutdowns are typically losers, political losers, for the folks who caused them. And I think the president's getting some really bad advice on this one. I think he's being told that he has to appeal and double down to his base. Admittedly, a shrinking base if you look at exit polls from the 2018 midterm. But he's got to double down on his base on the issue of the wall. That's a point of authenticity for him. And he was already burned pretty significantly when he backed away from the wall during the last appropriations deal, funding deal. And so for him, this is a do or die moment. It's zero sum. But what's so untenable, I think, politically for Republicans writ large on this issue is the fact that as recently as a month ago, you had Senate Republicans. Keep in mind, Republicans controlled the Senate, and just a month ago, Republicans also controlled the House. They controlled Congress. You had Republicans and Democrats passing in a bipartisan way spending bills for this year. In fact, the Senate-controlled, Mitch McConnell-led Senate passed by unanimous consent a bill to keep the government open until February. But now, fast forward a few weeks, today, Mitch McConnell refuses to even bring that bill. A bill that he supported, that his party supported just weeks ago, refuses to bring that bill to the floor for a vote. And that's just not the way you should govern. There's a right way to negotiate building the wall. There's a wrong way to negotiate building the wall. The right way would be to open the government up, get paychecks for the 800,000 federal workers who are struggling right now, they and their families, and then negotiate a comprehensive immigration deal. That's the right way forward.
Adolfo, do you believe there should be a wall? Do you believe there is a crisis on the southern border? And what do you make of the shutdown?
Well, I do believe there's a wall. There's a need for a wall. We have a wall already. Democrats and Republicans voted for a wall. There's a good chunk of wall along the border in California that's been quite effective, supported by Nancy Pelosi and all the other Democrats at one time, including Barack Obama. So the wall is something Democrats and Republicans have supported, certainly in the past. Absolutely, there is a crisis. It's a strange thing when you look back at newspapers in October and November, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they refer to the humanitarian crisis and the border crisis and the crisis on the border at that time. And now there is no crisis because President Trump says there is a crisis. The problem, and Dave's narrative sounded just wonderful. Except it's divorced from reality, Dave, with all due respect in this regard. Nancy Pelosi,
I figured you'd have a problem with it.
Yeah, the Speaker has said this very clearly. There's not going to be a dime for the wall. So the President can't open back the government or agree to open the government if the Democrats have already said they won't negotiate at any point about a wall or a barrier. So that's the impediment we have here.
All right, a couple of other things. David, what are you expecting from Michael Cohen's open testimony in February?
Well, it's going to be a major event, must-watch TV. I actually thought it was pretty interesting what happened earlier this week in response to comments that the president made directed at Michael Cohen over the weekend when he essentially threatened Cohen in general terms and suggested that investigators look, I think, at Cohen's father-in-law. Chairman Elijah Cummings and two other House Democratic chairmen wrote a letter to the White House essentially saying to the president, you can't do this. You can't interfere with a congressional investigation, and you certainly can't interfere with a witness who's been called to testify before the Congress. And so I actually think, separate from the Cohen testimony, which will be very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to delve into the particularities of how Michael Cohen maintains that the president directed him to commit campaign finance violations. But I think it's also setting up a pretty interesting political challenge between the Congress and the White House, especially if the president does try to intervene in any way in Michael Cohen's testimony. And, if anything, this is a bit of a foreshadowing, harbinger for the types of showdowns I think we're going to see heading into this year now that Democrats control the House. And that's something the president hasn't had to deal with before. And he hasn't had to really reconcile with the fact that Democrats now have subpoena power.
Adolfo, are you concerned about the Cohen testimony?
Well, not at all.
No?
First of all, no, not at all. I think the president got it right where he said absolutely uninterested. And That doesn't matter to him one bit. I think that's what the president's words were. But I'll tell you what I think that testimony is about is political theater. Because the so-called sensitive matters, and Lanny Davis, his lawyer, has already stated this, and anything that has to do with the ongoing Mueller investigation, anything that's been something sensitive to prosecutors is not going to be permitted. He won't be permitted to answer those questions that they're even asked. He's meeting with Democratic staff beforehand. And what it is, this is, again, part of this broader narrative to try to embarrass President Trump. What this will be about is nothing about the president's legal issues or any of the investigations that we've been hearing about so much, but about Donald Trump, the person and the personality and this type of thing. So obviously there is bad blood. This is, of course, a felon, Mr. Cohen. This is a person who's lied. This is a person who's taped his client. This is a president, meaning President Trump. This is a person who has zero credibility. And what the Democrats are putting him up to do is just simply try to personally smear the president. And that's all this will amount to, and it will be political theater.
And gentlemen, I want to personally invite you back.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Larry.
Dave, too. Thank you, Larry.
Adolfo.
I'm now joined by Richard Painter, professor of law, University of Minnesota. He was the chief White House ethics lawyer during the administration of George W. Bush. He joins us from Minneapolis. Let's get his read on the reports this week from the New York Times and Washington Post. And it deals, of course, with Trump's behavior toward Russia. What do you make of it, Richard?
Well, Trump's behavior toward Russia has been very odd from the beginning. His meetings with Vladimir Putin that he doesn't want anyone else to be in on. The secrecy surrounding the Trump administration's policies toward Russia, the resistance to imposing sanctions. What happened at the Republican National Convention when the Russians were there trying to manipulate what was on the platform. And, of course, the Russian role in the election, Trump's financial connections with Russia. You put it all together, and we have a very, very suspicious situation. And it could be a dangerous situation if indeed the President of the United States turns out to be a tool of the Russians or a Russian mole, basically reporting back to Putin what's going on here. We have no idea.
Washington Post reports that he concealed details of his interactions with Putin, even from his own staff. Reports the president confiscated the translator's notes. Can that translator be subpoenaed to testify?
The translator could be subpoenaed to testify by Robert Mueller or by the United States House of Representatives. The translator should be subpoenaed. And this, once again, is an indication that something's wrong with the president's relationship with Vladimir Putin. We don't know exactly what's wrong. We know about the financial ties he has with Russians. We know about the Russian role in the election. But we don't know exactly what's going on here, but it is very, very suspicious when the President of the United States will not trust his own staff with information about what he's saying to the Russians and what the Russians are saying to him.
How far do you think the committee will go with Michael Cohen?
I hope they would go as far as they can with Michael Cohen, because Michael Cohen has done a lot of legal work for Donald Trump over the years. And this isn't just about paying off various women who've had affairs with Donald Trump and various sex scandals. It's also about his dealings in Russia. I am quite confident that Michael Cohen knows a lot about the Trump business empire and what the president's been doing in Russia before he became president, and perhaps some of what he's been doing after he became president.
Richard, you're a legal scholar. Trump continues to say if Congress won't provide the money to build a border wall, he may declare a national emergency. Would that hold up in court?
I don't think so. Now, we got to remember there'd be two pieces here. First, the good news is if he decides to declare the national emergency, then there's no reason for him not to reopen the government. And they ought to reopen the government, at least put a stop to this shutdown, and then he takes his chances in the courts with the national emergency. The problem with the national emergency approach legally is what he's doing is saying that there's a national security emergency. He's going to dig into either the Department of Defense budget or the national disaster budget and build a wall. So he is going to embark on a construction project that Congress specifically has refused to authorize. I believe that the courts are going to hold that to be an unconstitutional usurpation of power by the president. But since he's been talking about it, I'd say he might as well go ahead and try it and reopen the government, put an end to this shutdown, and then see what the courts have to say about his idea of building the wall on his own, because Congress is not going to be giving it to him. And the longer this shutdown goes on, the more it's going to cost the taxpayer, the more painful it's going to be for our government employees.
The Senate Judiciary Committee is going to hold confirmation hearings on Attorney General nominee William Barr this week. I interviewed Barr a few times years ago. Should he be confirmed?
He is a good man. He's a very, very good record, as having served previously as Attorney General under President Bush. The problem is that he cannot become Attorney General of the United States unless he unequivocally promises the Senate Judiciary Committee that he is not going to interfere with the Mueller investigation, that he is not going to cause the Mueller investigation to come to a premature end, that he's not going to tell Robert Mueller what he can and cannot investigate. We simply cannot have the President of the United States, who is being investigated, possibly as a Russian mole, turn around and tell his Attorney General he needs to shut down the independent counsel who's investigating the Russians. That's unacceptable. So I want to see a promise from William Barr that he is going to recuse from the Russia investigation.
Richard, as always, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Richard Painter, Professor of Law, University of Minnesota, and thank you for joining me on this edition of Politicking. Remember, you can join the conversation on my Facebook page or tweet me at Kingsthings. And don't forget to use the Politicking hashtag. And that's all for this edition of Politicking.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.
In a world of fake partisan news, lies, and conspiracy,
It's time to wake up, to dig deeper, to hit the stories that mainstream media refuses to tell. More than ever, we need to be smarter. We need to stop slamming the door on the facts and shouting past each other. It's time for critical thinking. It's time to fight for the middle, for the truth. The time is now for watching closer, for watching the Hawks.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.